everybody, and welcome back into Cult Film Cafe. This is episode 3 on the Warriors, and if you haven't already checked out episodes 1 and 2, please do so before you listen to this one. And yes, were great episodes, and we took a deep dive into the Warriors in terms of cult film status and things like that, and they're just some really, really good stuff in there, so please give them a listen. And as always, I am joined by my co-host Kenzie McLean.
Hello there.
And the guest on this film, The Warriors, is Andrew Cowell.
Hi, happy to be here.
So on this episode, this is where we look at the film in terms of if it meets enough of the criteria based on episode 2 to be considered a cult film in our opinions. So I'm going to open it up and say that yes, we broke this down using the 8 rules of Cult Film Cafe, and yes, the Warriors hit a lot of those
Did not hit all.
rules. Yeah, I would say that it hit most of them. Some stronger than others.
Yeah.
So yes, in my opinion, I would easily consider this to be a cult film based on our discussion in episode 2.
Yeah, I mean, it does tick all the boxes for me, and it ticks all the rules, the 8 rules. It's not, I mean, some of it maybe not as much based on, like, you know, memorable, if it's memorable, if it's quotable, but it is definitely a cult movie. Make no mistake there.
When I think of cult movie, The Warriors is one of the first films that comes into my head. It's just one of those ones you look at, and even just by the look at it, you can just kind of tell that that's a cult movie.
When we see the ocean, we figure we're home. We're safe.
This time you got it wrong.
Why'd you do it? Why'd you waste Cyrus?
No reason. I just like doing things like that.
Let's do it. Me and you.
One-on-one? You're crazy. You're dead. All of you. And you know it. You're dead. Swan!
Yeah, I think it's like one of those things when you open up the discussion of cult film. I think it is a film that definitely is one of the first ones to come out of people's mouths and into their minds when you speak about cult, and obviously that was such an easy discussion for us in episode 2 when we were breaking down the sort of the house rule, so to speak, and how we would distinguish cult film here at Cult Film Cafe. Definitely a cult film.
It's become part of pop culture. I mean, it was in the episode of The Simpsons, it was in Bob's Burgers. Yeah, it's just become part of the pop culture, and even nowadays there are talks of it being remade, possibly, or getting a remake. Haven't heard much about that, but it's still fresh in a lot of people's minds, I guess, especially with people that went to see this movie as teens. I mean, we just discovered that a lot of people that are in our lives, I won't name for privacy's sake, but this is their favourite movie, and we would never have expected that out of them.
Yeah, it's a quite weird film, because it's definitely, I definitely see it as a cult film, but I think it's just really, it's a lot of things about it, because it is quite a popular cult film, but on this other hand, I feel like a lot of people haven't heard of it either. Like, I didn't know about the film for like years, up until my dad brought it up to me out of nowhere. I had never even heard anything about the film at all. So I feel like in a way it does kind of still fly under the radar, even if it is still quite a popular cult film.
Yeah, I think that's the way with cult films in general, is they do tend to sort of still stay under the radar, even though they are well-known cult films. The whole premise of a cult film is it not being non-mainstream, I suppose, and even though it's got like a big following and now and that it's created this fan base, it still wouldn't necessarily be a film that people would recommend. And I think touching on sort of the older audience there, Andrew was saying about the older generation growing up with it.
Yeah.
I think I would just wanted to bring up the younger generation sort of would know, maybe not necessarily young generation now, but sort of mid-2000s young generation through the Rockstar Warriors video game, which was developed in the mid-2000s.
Oh yeah. It's got a video game adaptation, and there's a comic book adaptation of the film.
There's no comic books, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I should point out that I was born in 95, and I was introduced to this movie about when I was like 13 or 14. I'd been recommended it to me, so.
It's quite funny. I was about the same age. I think I watched it the day before my 13th birthday. I think it was something like that, 2014.
I mean, I'm the old man of the group, sadly. Born in '89. The thing about this film is, I wasn't necessarily familiar with it till very late. I mean, probably late teens, early 20s before anybody had sort of mentioned it. And like I said, I owned a copy of the DVD. I've owned a copy of the DVD for 10 plus years now, and I've never watched it. I went through a phase where I was just buying DVDs so frequently and never watching them, which became a habit. I mean, I've watched most of the films that I've owned are like probably 80-85%, but yeah, it's like if you collect anything, you'll get around to watching it. I mean, it's the same with anything. I became a DVD collector. It became a passion and a love of mine, and trying to find these kind of offbeat sort of cult movies as well. That became something. And obviously, based on episode 2, obviously we broke it down sort of deeper, and yes, such a memorable sort of movie, and that's maybe why it sort of easily hits cult status for us here on the podcast.
But I suppose the question is, does it belong somewhere in the top 100 must-see cult movies?
Yeah, that's funny you should say that. Yeah, so obviously the podcast is based on a poster that's got 100 must-see cult films or cult movies on it. It says on the poster. I like the word film over the word movie. That's just a personal preference. But yeah, that's where I would say this is where it's going to be the harder part as we get further into this series of podcasts, where it's going to be difficult to determine whether it should be on the list of 100 cult films or not. I would say personally it's safe to say for me that it would belong on that list personally. How about you, Andrew?
I guess the question is, where does it belong on the list? Because I do think it belongs there, but is it in the lower 10s or high 100s? I'd say. It's kind of a tricky thing. It's a great movie, don't get me wrong, but it's not, because of its narrative, it's not too complex. You can't really dig your teeth into it. But I'd say it's somewhere in the 70s region of the 100. I'd say somewhere in the 70s.
Well, I would honestly go lower with it. I would definitely put it in the top 100 of the must-see cult films. It's definitely not in the 10s. Like, I don't think it's going to be. I just don't think it will be. It's a good one, but there's probably as we get through the list of the films, there'll be other ones I think will definitely just easily beat it. But I think a fair assumption to put it is around about, I think, in the 30s, and I'm going to go with. Just going to maybe go with 36, but I think I'll go 34.
You've pinpointed exactly where in the top 100 that you're going to place it. That's very specific. I mean, that's maybe another thing that we could add to the podcast is once we flesh out this poster, is maybe see where we could add other films that come to mind in terms of cult status. But I mean, for me, I would easily place it in the top 50. I think there's so many people that, especially my age or older, if I spoke to about cult film, it would probably be, if I asked them to name 10, I think it would be quite an easy one to name for them. I'm not saying that they would put it in the top 10, but if it can become out a lot of people's mouths really easily, I would say it would have to be top 50. I don't really know where I would place it. For me, I would say there's probably easily 20 more must-see cult films in my opinion. Especially ones that are a bit more complex, like Andrew said. It was quite a simple film, but that doesn't detract from the quality, because sometimes simple films done well are better than complex movies done bad. And just because you've got a complex narrative doesn't necessarily mean that your film should jump something that's simple. I mean, it all depends on a lot of the technical aspects as well.
I mean, when you have that budget and that premise, and that's what you've decided you want to do, it does take a lot of skill to try and pull that off, despite, the narrative, again, not being complex at all or anything like that. But for what it is, it does it really well. It's not great, but it's really good. And this is top 70s is where I stand with that, really.
That's fair enough. I don't know, I still feel it's lower, but I guess I think what will be interesting to see is as we get through the list, because I don't know if I would if I would put it higher. I feel like I think it's very fair where I've put it, but as we get through the movies in the list, I don't know, maybe I'll change my mind. I'd kind of like to see if once we get through quite a majority of the films, and it's still a while away, but I'd like to try and give a number to each specific film if we believe that they are cult films, and see how we put it, and if we'd add any other specific films into the top 100.
Best of luck with that. That sounds really tough.
It'll take a while.
I mean, it's something that would take a while, obviously, if we're going to collate our own cult film cafe top 100 cult films. That would take a lot of time, but I mean, it's something that I'm happy to explore. I would like to see, once we kind of finish this 100 movies on the poster, and see just how many of them we would put in. First of all, how many of them meet like the cult films sort of criteria to start with, and then from there see how many of them we would place in the top 100. And I suppose that'll give us a framework to work with and potentially add some other films outside the box. I mean, I've got a lot of kind of, I suppose for us, adding more sort of current films, I think what lacks from first glance and sort of reading the poster a bit more in depth is there seems to be a lack of sort of new cinema, I would so to speak, sort of mid-2000s on. I mean, a lot of the films, if not all of them, were probably released prior to sort of 2005. There's maybe a couple on there that I can think of that were released after that. So there is probably a lot of newer cult films that could usurp and leapfrog some of the films on there.
I suppose that's the thing. A lot of people are going to have different interpretations of what is a cult movie, and I think a lot of people, when they think of cult movie, they think of an old movie. But it's quite interesting because it tells you about the person that made the poster, and obviously this podcast is just about sort of demystifying the process of trying to figure out what makes a cult movie a cult movie.
Yeah, it's the big question: is how does each person what do they define a cult film to be? And I think we'll get to see a lot of people's opinions as the podcast goes along, as we get different people on.
Yeah, definitely. It's been one of these. I mean, this has definitely been an interesting start to the podcast, and it's been very insightful. And obviously, doing research and speaking to different people about it, it does, when you start to narrow the field and try and determine and differentiate different aspects from one another of what is deemed cult and not, that's when it does become sort of a sort of subjective sort of viewpoint. Everybody's going to have their own opinion, and I think here we have to sort of stand by our own guns and look at where we stand and what we feel are the sort of biggest elements, so to speak, of what really makes a movie a cult film. And I stand by that, and I strongly believe that we have a list of criteria which is definitely the sort of big kind of ticking boxes of it. I mean, there's going to be people that will come on and argue different points, and that's totally valid. And I'm all for that debate, and debate's always healthy. and obviously speaking to fellow film lovers and cinephiles is always interesting.
Yeah, you get a lot of varying opinions out there on film Twitter nowadays and film spaces, so it's an interesting point of discussion.
It brings a lot more to getting everyone's opinion on things. I feel like it widens everything. It can also help you rethink and try and see what's most kind of correct in a way. But I mean, it's hard because a lot of it is opinion based. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the more you analyse film text, the sort of the more your eyes are opened in determining sort of these determining factors. I think that's when you start looking at film from a more analytical viewpoint. I mean, it's always difficult to sort of explore something as broad as cult. I mean, if somebody says a cult film, I think that's easy for a lot of people that are film lovers and cinephiles would be able to pick a cult film out of a range of films, but would they necessarily be able to break it down? And I suppose that's where this podcast is exploring, and it's something that's a bit different, and I hope that the people listening will really enjoy the conversation amongst ourselves and the guests each week. And obviously it's been great having Andrew on, who's really got an interesting viewpoint when it comes to a lot of these different things, and it's great to have healthy debate. I mean, obviously this one was rather easy for us. Andrew picked such a well-known sort of film with cult status, so it's made this episode quite an easy one for us. But there's going to be some in the near future which are going to be a lot more difficult, and probably having a lot more debate as to whether they hit the factors on the podcast.
You looked at the whole 100 film list. Is there any other films that you thought on the list you could maybe have? Is there any other ones you thought about?
Well, without going into spoiler territory, there are a couple of things on there that I could have picked, and vice versa. There are things on there that aren't there, actually, that surprised me that they're not there, considering it's 100 cult movies. But if I had to go with another pick, maybe just a suggestion for the next guest, Army of Darkness. I'm big into horror, so that's my sort of territory.
Good suggestion. I love that film.
Well, there you have a wee spoiler of another film that is going to be coming very soon. And Andrew, you're more than welcome to be a repeat guest on the podcast.
No problem.
So thanks everybody for tuning in and listening to the podcast. I hope you all enjoyed what we had to say and our debate and sort of discussion, and I hope that you understand where the podcast is going and how we're trying to break down these films. It's a bit different to your general sort of review style podcast where we're just basically talking about a film and reviewing it, although we do touch on that. I mean, in an earlier episode we did do that, and it's been a massive pleasure having Andrew on. Thanks for joining us, Andrew.
No, thank you for having me. It's been a privilege. I love being part of podcasts and talking about films, and I got to do that today. So thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Kenzie.
No problem.
That's all we have on the Warriors for you. And like I said, thanks for listening. And don't forget that you can get in contact with us via Instagram at Cult Film Cafe, or via email by emailing thecultfilmpodcast@gmail.com. And I would, if you want to get in contact with myself, you can find me on Instagram at 081331 Productions. And if you want to find Kenzie, you can find him on Instagram at...
I'm at Doge Dogs. It might be underscore, but it's Doge Dog, DOGEDOGGZ, something like that.
And if you would like to get in contact with Andrew and see some of the cool productions that he has coming up, and you can find them at...
It's ACowl0 on Instagram.
So if you check everybody out, you can see what we're up to and what we're about. And yeah, don't forget to get in contact with the show. And it's been great talking about films with you. I hope you enjoyed. Thanks for listening.
Thanks.
Podcast out.